The Wonder Years have released another album that's getting tons of acclaim from critics and fans alike. I really enjoyed The Hum Goes On Forever on my first and second listen, but since then I haven't really found myself wanting to go back and revisit it, and it's been out almost 2 weeks. My pre-ordered vinyl should be here soon, which is great because apparently the Wonder Years are a vinyl band.
That's the other thing about us. We're a live band and we're a vinyl band. Yeah.
But that made me realize that this was a pattern. I will almost always enjoy a Wonder Years album on release, and I'll listen to it a couple of times right out the gate. But after that, I'm almost never going back to revisit it. Well, that got me thinking. If you ask me my top 5 favorite bands, the Wonder Years are probably going to be on that list. If you ask me what my top 10 albums of all time are, The Greatest Generation is certainly in that conversation. Despite that, they never show up on my Spotify Wrapped playlist. And even though I own every single album, either on CD or vinyl, I hardly ever play them. Well, today I want to talk about why that might be, because I don't think I'm alone here. You see a lot of online forums that are nonstop praise, but if you scroll way down, you'll see people who don't quite get the hype and the love for the Wonder Years. And a lot of them phrase their comments like I am here, where maybe they're in between liking a record, but not enjoying it enough to go back and listen to it frequently. And please note that this is my own terrible opinion. My goal here is not to hate on the Wonder Years. It's not to hate on fans of the Wonder Years. I love the Wonder Years. I think they're a great band, necessary for the scene, and they're super innovative. And they put on an amazing live show. I have loved every time I see them. They are a great band. All I'm trying to explore here is, if I'm saying those things, how come I never really want to go back and listen to their music? Well, firstly, the songs aren't much fun. Albums from the Wonder Years are usually pretty dark and pretty heavy, especially their last 3 studio releases. Dan Campbell crafts songs and writes lyrics that are profoundly sad and sometimes depressing, which means that these are really tough and emotionally draining listens.
The first time I heard this record, I just crumbled.
It also means that the Wonder Years are at their best whenever Dan Campbell is firing on all cylinders, which luckily is most of the time. My favorite songs are the ones that are able to get a lyric or a verse just burned into my mind, like the chorus on There There, which I swore I was going to get tattooed on myself when I turned 18, or the final minute of Cigarettes and Saints, which still gives me chills every time I hear it. And the entirety of Came Out Swinging lives in my brain rent-free. So despite Dan Campbell being at the top of his game lyrically on Hum Goes On Forever, it still doesn't resonate as much as those 3 songs I mentioned. What I'm really trying to say here is that despite the Wonder Years albums being super dense thematically and lyrically, they're not a ton of fun, so I'm less drawn to go back and listen to them. If we want to compare it to an extreme, let's look at Blink-182's Enema of the State. That album is extremely digestible. It's a Krispy Kreme glazed donut. It practically evaporates in your mouth. But the Wonder Years album is like raw broccoli. You gotta chew it and chew it and chew it and chew it and chew it some more. And you never want to go back and eat raw broccoli. You'd much rather grab another donut. But the FDA and the food pyramid and your parents and the critics are all telling you that broccoli is better than donuts. Done with that analogy. It's the same with movies like Manchester by the Sea or Requiem for a Dream. Although I think they're brilliant movies, I don't ever want to go back and rewatch them. They're just too heavy. Since I don't have fun with these albums, you can really feel the emotional commitment and the time commitment that it takes to listen to a Wonder Years album. Which brings me to my next point. These albums are too long. Their last albums are an average of 45 minutes long. Well, if the album's good, of course you want more of it, but anyone who's had a 2-pound candy bar knows that more isn't always better. And maybe the greatest sin of these albums is that they're just too long. I mean, nothing's worse than someone pouring their heart out emotionally, and you just feel bored. That's why I think that these albums could have been trimmed by 1 or 2 songs and been even better for it. In fact, I'm very curious what a Wonder Years EP would look like. If Dan Campbell had a time constraint of 15 or 20 minutes, I think they'd put out something that would be unlike anything we've heard from them before. You don't really feel the length of the album as much in The Greatest Generation, but in their last 3 albums, they've become so slow and deliberate that the length is really felt. Like they feel like 50 minutes or longer. And that isn't a criticism of the Wonder Years or Dan Campbell or how he writes his songs. I think they've crafted amazing albums. I mean, look at Aaron West and the Roaring Twenties. This is just how Dan Campbell sees and writes songs. Like he loves to tell stories across an entire album.
If you listen to Hum, it's going to explain to you why. It is sequenced specifically to be an enjoyable listening experience from front to back that ebbs and flows and gets intense and pulls back and tells a story all the way through for 12 songs.
But what happens when you tell stories? You're going to have rising actions, falling actions. There's going to be ebbs and flows even more throughout the album because you're leading to something in a story and there's less contained in a single song. In these last 3 albums especially, there have been a lot of lulls. There's been a lot of valleys and not many peaks, which makes you really feel the length of these albums in its entirety. And for me, it makes me not want to go back and listen to it because, one, it's a huge time commitment, but also I feel like I'm getting more out of a story when I hear it the first time. And going back to it repeatedly and often takes away the initial impact of that story, just for me. I can see how people would love to sit down with this album all the time and would get a ton out of it every time. But for me, the first listen is the most important listen. And I find that when I spread out listens more, I forget like where something was going. I forget how a chorus hits and what song is next. And that makes the album more enjoyable for me when I'm going into it as blind as I could be. Well, you might be thinking, why don't you just listen to the songs that you really like? But that brings me to my next point, my main point of why I don't listen to the albums very often. Because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, look at this quote from Dan, basically saying, we don't write songs, we write albums.
We make albums. That's the thing that we do. We don't make groups of songs.
So I feel like when I'm listening to the Wonder Years, I'm going to get the most out of it by listening to an album front to back. And this really shines light on why their singles have always confused me. Because when it's removed from the context of the album, I think it's far less enjoyable. After The Greatest Generation, I don't think they've really put out a great single. They're great songs, but they're so much better in the context of the album that I'm never going to put them on their own in a playlist. And I'm sure it felt weird for the band to put those albums out into the world devoid of the context of the album that they were in. And this just goes to prove my point here. Every song props each other up and makes the album so much better than it should be just looking at the songs alone. If I did a tier list of an album like No Closer to Heaven, I'd probably put every song in B or C tier except for Cardinals and Cigarettes and Saints. I'd put Cigarettes and Saints in S tier and Cardinals in A tier. But if you asked me to put this album in a tier list, it would for sure be an A tier album for me. I love this record. A small example here is how much more I love Cardinals after hearing Brothers and before it. I think the build-up really makes Cardinals stand out more. And it's even got a companion song, which maybe has been lost in the depths of pop punk history, where Dan Campbell wrote lyrics over a Motion City Soundtrack song. And he calls it a companion piece to Cardinals. It's like a response to Cardinals in a way. And I think hearing all 3 of those really gives Cardinals this awe, this presence in the album that it doesn't have on its own. Where it's just a good song on its own, it's an amazing song in the album. Pierre from Motion City Soundtrack and Dan from the Wonder Years talk about that project. It's super interesting. I'll link it in the description. Go give it a watch because you can't find this song on Spotify. And it might get lost in the depths of history if we don't preserve it. So go give it a watch. You won't be disappointed. But as the years go on through their discography, those payoffs become a lot more subdued. The peaks are lower. The valleys are lower. It's just not as exciting. Like that thing about Cardinals I was talking about doesn't happen very much in these new albums, in my opinion. I know people love these albums. I'm not saying that Hum Goes On Forever isn't a great album, because it is. The last thing I want to mention is I don't like the production on these albums. And you might be screaming at me, Connor, the production is bad on purpose. And yes, it is. It sounds that way on purpose. Dan Campbell has said so himself.
We don't like pop production. Like glossy production is just never really fit what we do. And that's a complaint for some people, but like I want it to sound like you are standing in the room experiencing us.
I know it's not a hot take to say that the Wonder Years has too many guitarists. And Dan Campbell is so hot in the mix that the guitars often get lost. You wouldn't even know. Like you look at this band, it's like, oh yeah, him right there, he plays guitar. That guy, that's a guitarist. That other guy, he's a guitarist. Him right there, guitarist. The drummer, he's a drummer, but he can also play guitar. And Dan Campbell, well, he's the vocalist, but sometimes he can play the guitar. There's just a lot of strings in this band, and they don't really get a chance to shine on their own, unfortunately. I think they all blend together most of the time in the mix. And you see what Dan Campbell says about the band, and they want you to feel like you're in the room with them when they're playing. They don't like clean production, and they even acknowledge that the production on their albums is a complaint for some people. For me, that's not enjoyable. For me, when I want to sit down and listen to a record, I like when I'm able to pick out things, and I'm sure there's people with keener ears than me who are able to appreciate the bass lines here and some of the guitar work more than I can, because I'm just not able to differentiate what he's playing to what this guy's playing. For me, it becomes a frustrating listen. And all of this culminates into making the vocal performance and the lyrics even more important to me in a Wonder Years record, because I'm not getting a ton out of it instrumentally. Before I wrap up, I just want to roast Dan a little bit, because it seems like the release of every record has him talking about how this is the most Wonder Years the Wonder Years have ever sounded.
I feel like if you've been following the Wonder Years, this is where it's been going.
The Greatest Generation is definitely a Wonder Years record.
There are a number of songs on this album that are in contention for favorite piece of music that has come out of this band and that I've been a part
I
of.
think this record shows a new awareness of the band we are.
The best definition of our sound and of us as people in a sonic form.
It's the best version of our band.
It's the best version of us.
I'm really glad that they're putting out albums that they think is their best work ever. That's what you want from a band and an artist, is for them to think that they're constantly evolving in a great way. But every time they say this is the most Wonder Years a record is, I wonder where the Wonder Years is going. Like when they go full Wonder Years in 10 years, we might get an album that's just shoegaze industrial butt rock that's recorded in a crematorium because that fits the theme of the album, and they're gonna say we're not gonna release any singles off this record because out of context of the album the singles just aren't enjoyable, and actually the album is one 50-minute track. There's actually no songs. It's one super long song. That might be full Wonder Years, even if that's what it comes to. I'm going to pre-order that record because I love the Wonder Years and I love what they're doing. And even though I'm ribbing them a little bit and I've maybe offered some critiques that you don't agree with, I love The Greatest Generation and No Closer to Heaven and Suburbia. I just like the Upsides and Sister Cities, and I haven't listened to The Hum Goes On Forever or thought about it and ruminated on it enough to decide where that album lands in my ranking of their discography. But I'm always excited when they announce a new project. I'm always excited to listen to their new album because they tell really compelling stories in their records, and they make a really fun fan experience. I wish I was in Philadelphia for the release day of this record. They put out a documentary and did an acoustic set, which you can watch live. It's amazing. Everyone, this has just been me trying to justify why I don't listen to albums that I claim to love so much. It's hard to talk about a band this way because I do love what they're doing, and I'm so grateful that they're part of this scene. Please go and support the Wonder Years. Go see them live if you haven't, because they put on an amazing live show, and they really do sound the way that they do on their studio albums. If you enjoyed this video at all, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps out this channel, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I've got some videos coming up about some more pop punk bands and albums that I love, and I hope to see you there. Until then, later.